How are we feeling today? Justin, how you feeling?
Doing good.
Feeling good?
Yeah.
All right, you're looking good today. All right. We're going to still be in 1 Corinthians today, but kind of take a slightly different approach. I want to start with a question. Where is God? Do you remember the first time you asked that question, where is God? And I'm not talking about that kind of profound question that perhaps comes in that moment of deep despair or after great tragedy, and you say, where is God? No, I'm talking about that childish wonder. When you first kind of try to figure out, where is God? Where does He live? What does He look like? How many of you have had in mind, at least some point in your life, kind of a picture, an image of God? You've tried to put Him in your head, and you're like, I got a rough kind of notion of what God looks like. Does He look anything like the picture from the Sistine Chapel? This is Michelangelo's rendering. Or perhaps the more well-known version where he creates Adam, reaching forth. Kind of the distinguished, older-looking gentleman with the flowing gray beard. We have a hard time praying to something that we can't visualize. So often we have these kind of images in our heads, and we might, especially with God, we kind of leave it rough around the edges. We don't want to give too much detail to it, but we have these images nonetheless. And what I mean by this is, for example, most of us would think of God as a male being, and perhaps would even be offended if we started referring to God as mother, even though the Bible does in some ways. But is God really gendered? Yet as a kid, I think, for me, the harder question was not always, what does He look like, but it was, where is God? Initially it was always, well, God's up there somewhere, because, for me, heaven was up there. After all, who looks down when talking to God? If you're praying to the floor, that seems almost blasphemous. But as I tell my students, there's no reason that Jesus had to ascend up to heaven, as if heaven is up there somewhere, past Pluto. Follow, the second star to the right, and then on toward morning, isn't that where heaven is? No, I'm sorry, that's Neverland. I get confused sometimes. But it's a fascinating question, right? Where is God? Where does He live? Where does He hang out? And are those even appropriate questions to ask? Is that the way to think about it? Humans have been looking for the divine or the sacred for millennia. Ancient peoples often, would distinguish between the sacred and the profane. The profane was the ordinary world. That was the common world. But the sacred, that's the place or the things that connected you to the divine, to the spirit world. And the sacred was different. It was sometimes very frightening, and sometimes it was awe-inspiring. And in some ancient groups, and still today, there is a belief that natural objects like rocks and trees and streams were inhabited by spirits. And so we call this belief animism. And it had the advantage of making the divine, the spirit world close and convenient and in some sense concrete. Something that lives all around us. In other ancient peoples, they had special places that they believed provided this connection to the divine world. And so there would be perhaps a grove of trees or a lake. And in many religions, it would be some kind of high place, a mountain, where you could specifically and specially encounter the divine. It was places that were given reference. These locations were often thought to give you special access to the divine, to connect you, as if you could connect easier in that location than in others. And perhaps we can relate to this feeling, because I think that we also have places where you may feel especially connected to God. That's why we go to nature when we go on retreats. And sometimes when we're out in the mountains or out in the woods, we feel a special connection to God, but it has nothing to do, hopefully, with animism. But I remember I went to college in Arizona, and I would often, especially when I was feeling kind of down, I'd drive out to the desert at night, and I had this wide open swath of stars. It was so vast because it was dark. and the sky was open, it wasn't blocked by any trees, and I would just feel so insignificant. And it reminded you that there was something bigger than yourself. And Paul himself, of course, he often talks about nature as kind of revealing God, as a testimony about God. Yet sometime during about the 3rd millennium BC, temples began to be built, these permanent structures. And the temples served as the house for the god or the goddess of that particular city. And these were far larger complexes than we might imagine. In fact, I don't have a picture. I thought I had a picture before that. But there's these complexes of temples that would encompass vast spans of territory, because it wasn't just the temple proper, but it had fields in which you could raise food and animals for the sacrifices. It had rooms for servants and priests. Yet the focal point of the temple was the specific shrine where the image of the god or goddess was housed, where it resided. It was in that place, in that space, that the sacred entered into the world of the profane, where people could come to that space and they could encounter the divine. And the temple was believed to be that place where heaven and earth converge, and the divine made his or her presence felt. And in Babylonia, you have these things called ziggurats, these kind of stair-step temples that began to be built. And many believe that one theory is that was kind of a stairway for the god, that it symbolized the connection between these divine beings and the human, a place where they could come down and they could encounter humans. And the temple had other social functions as well that were very, very important. And so the temple employed lots of people. It supported orphans and widows. It was a place that kind of held societies together in many ways. And these things have been built for centuries, all over the globe. And so the people at Corinth were very familiar with temples. And so one of the pictures we have here is of the Acro-Corinth. This is the next one, should be the Acro-Corinth. Yes, this is the space if you're going from the downtown center of Corinth and you look back, there's this large structure. And it was on the Acro-Corinth where the famous, or sometimes infamous, Temple of Aphrodite was housed, that went back for centuries. If you travel to Corinth today, there's actually one that's very, very close to the marketplace. It's the remains of the Temple of Apollo. That should be the next slide. You can go see that today. So the Corinthians had lots of temples. In fact, we're familiar with temples. We have one in our own city, right? Complete with a life-size, or actually larger than life-size, statue of Athena, called the Parthenon. You can go visit today. But that's a replica of an ancient Greek temple. So we're familiar with this. Yet temples, of course, were not limited to the pagan world. The temple you probably know best is that of the Jewish people, the temple in Jerusalem. And in many ways, it was very similar to structures like the temples around it. This structure, and I think we should have a picture of that as well. Yes, there is. This structure is composed of various parts, and so you have this kind of larger area of the temple complex that includes courtyards and storage areas and a place for the altar. And this larger complex was called the Heron, the temple. And that's when people were talking about going to the temple, they were talking about this larger structure. But the focal point of the temple, in this particular picture, it's that highest structure, that little rectangular building in the upper left corner. That particular structure is the building that in the pagan religions, of course, would have been the house for the image, the place where the statue of the god or goddess was. This shrine in the Greek temple structure is called the naos, different than the Heron. Yet, of course, you know that the difference between the Jewish temple and the Greek and Roman temples is that there was no image in that particular structure. In the Herodian temple here, you have a very far grander temple than what Solomon built, but it's on the same lines. It's structured in the same ways. And so the naos, that building there, is divided into two parts. You have the holy place, where the priests would go in every day, and they would light the candelabra, they would burn incense, they would change out the table of the presence of the showbread and so forth. And so they went into that space, but only the priest. You couldn't go in there as kind of an ordinary Jew. And then, of course, there was the space behind that space. They called it the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. That space, in ancient times, of course, contained the Ark of the Covenant. And it was there, in that space, above the mercy seat, that God's presence was thought to dwell. And so you couldn't go in there. Only the high priest went in there, and only once a year to make atonement. Now, of course, the Israelites knew that God wasn't localized in a temple. Solomon acknowledges this when he built his temple way back when. In fact, we have the scripture here that we can quote. But will God really dwell on earth? The heavens, even the highest heaven, cannot contain you. How much less this temple I have built, Solomon says. Yet give attention to your servant's prayer and his plea for mercy, O Lord my God. Hear my cry and the prayer that your servant is praying in your presence this day. May your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, this place which you have said, my name shall be there, so that you will hear the prayer of your servant and the prayers toward this place. That's in 1 Kings. You see, it was believed that in this space, it was a connecting point with the divine. It was the place where atonement was made. It was the place where people could come and offer their sacrifices. It was a place where they felt their prayers and their supplications would be heard, knowing that God had designated this space as a place to encounter Him. And so the most frequent phrase that you find in Hebrew for this place is called the house of God. The Beit HaElohim. For God in a special way was in this place. In fact, the Jews came to trust in this temple so much, in this sacred space so much, that they thought it was going to protect them from people like the Babylonians, which it didn't. God told them that through the prophets. But as we come now to Corinthians, as this is a background, Paul has all of these understandings in mind as he communicates and uses the image of temple in his writings. And specifically in 1 Corinthians, he uses this image in a couple of different ways. In a later passage that we'll deal with a few weeks from now, in chapter 6, verse 19 and following, Paul talks about each of us as individual Christians, as temples of the Holy Spirit. And he uses that message in this context to help them avoid sexual immorality. Recognize you can't do whatever you want because you have the Spirit within you. And we'll get to that text later. But this morning we're in chapter 3. And our text is verses 16 and 17. Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit lives in you? If anyone destroys God's temple, God will destroy him, for God's temple is sacred, and you are that temple. Now, two key points that we need to recognize here as we look at this passage. First, when Paul uses the word for temple, he's using the word naos, not hieron. He's referring specifically to that building that is the house for the shrine, not the larger temple complex. He says, you are the temple shrine. You are the house of God. You are the place where God's Spirit dwells. You are the point at which the sacred enters into the profane. You are the place where people can come to meet the divine. Second, in this passage, unlike in chapter 6, Paul is not talking about Christians as individuals. In this text, Paul uses the you in the plural form, and he's referring to the community, the church as a whole. The Spirit of God dwells in the Christian community as community. Not in their building. Remember, they don't even have a building. They're meeting in homes. But among them, as a gathered people. And this is a radical message if you think about it, because here in the city of Corinth, it's filled with temples that inspired awe. I mean, these things were huge and they had great beauty. They were made out of marble and they were painted and they were richly decorated in gold. They were served by priesthoods. They were visited by thousands. They were sources of pilgrimage. But Paul points to this very small group of people crammed into a house, composed of slaves and former slaves, mostly poor, few rich, people of lowly birth. And he says to them, you are the temple. It is in you and through you that the world will find God. As we said before, with the use of images, it was standard in Greek and Roman temples, and I think many of us, we weren't raised worshiping images, and it's kind of a hard thing for us to kind of understand. But we understand the function, right? In the ancient world, people desired a visual representation of their God. They wanted something they could see, something they could look upon, something that made it real, to focus their prayers and their supplications. And in this passage, Paul is saying, you, church, are that face. You are the image of God. It is in you and through you that people can see their Creator. Yet this passage has often been misunderstood, I think, because of what Paul says next. He warns against destroying God's temple. And many of, because they haven't understood the context, have assumed that this is referring to suicide. Christian and suicide. It has nothing to do with that. That's not what he means by destroying God's temple. Remember where we've been in this text, that the Corinthians are plagued by factions. And through the first 4 chapters, he is addressing that issue, and he's been promoting unity. And he's saying that disunity is what destroys the temple of God. So don't be the source of disunity. Don't be the one who's destroying the temple of God, because it prevents people from seeing God when you are not unified. And so the church, the Christian church, reveals God by living as this kind of alternative community. A community that lives according to the principles of its Creator. It is sacred, set-apart community. It is supposed to be different. It's not common. It's not like anything else. And God is seen through the way Christians interact with each other, the way they treat each other and they treat the world. And so it's in the church that people can encounter God. They carried on the mission of Israel that was supposed to be a light to the nations. And now, to serve as that light, the church must be different. So as we think about this text and it's significant for us, I think many still today search for God in sacred places. They look for sacred spaces. And when we hear the word church, it's hard for us, and for many people, not to think about buildings. And many people think of Christian churches, in terms of buildings, as sacred spaces. I mean, after all, where else would you flee if you want to get away from, like, werewolves and vampires and, I don't know what else, demons, I guess. You got to go to a Catholic church, though. It only works with Catholic church, right? So, got to go to one of those. But it's not talking about buildings at all, right? It has nothing to do with church buildings. The Spirit of God is among us this morning. Not because of this space, but because we are here. Because the community has gathered together. Without us, it's just ordinary space. But we together, as a community, are meant to serve as a shining light for those around us. To be a place where they can find God by seeing how we live and how we act, especially how we treat each other. So as we think about this idea, this concept, what does that mean to be the temple of God? Well, first of all, it doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean that we are some kind of holier-than-thou Christians who have it all together. No, we're still people who have our struggles and our failures. But it's what we do with those that matters. That we're not those who give in to those struggles and those sins, but we fight against them. And we encourage each other in our fight against it. That we lift each other up when we're falling down. We're still a place of brokenness. But we reflect the character of our God. Remember that Paul, when he writes this, he's writing to one of the most messed up churches in the history of Christianity. I mean, as we go through this letter, you see all the problems they have. But he still calls them the temple of God. So they can be the temple, we can be the temple. But it also means we have to work hard to get along with each other as Christians. I'm not just talking about us in this room, I'm talking about Christians as a whole. One of the greatest hurdles we face today is that Christian churches don't get along with each other. It's our inner squabbling. It's our divided community that causes us not to be able to be that light. How can we witness to reconciliation when we're not reconciled with each other? In a world that's plagued with terrorism and conflicts and war and hatred, Christians have to be that alternative community where those kinds of things don't exist. We have to be a place where we're not trying to be on top of one another, to be the best, where gossip and backbiting and jealousy have no place, where petty rivalries can't find a foothold. The church is supposed to be that place that when people walk into that community, not to the space, but to the community, they feel welcome. They feel as if they've come home for the very first time and they're not sure why. What is it about these people? But something about it is different. It's a place where they feel like they belong, where something just feels right. And lastly, I think, what that means for us to be the temple of God is to be a model of love and acceptance and grace and forgiveness. And that goes with how we can overcome these things. One of the ways that people can find God in the Christian church is when we model grace for them. That's why it's important. It doesn't matter that we're not perfect, because that's the whole point. You can't really model grace if you haven't done anything wrong and haven't ever received grace. But because we have done things wrong, because we have received grace, we can then model that. When people see us treating each other with grace and mercy and forgiveness, then God's grace becomes more visible to them. It becomes a reality. It becomes something tangible. Oh, that's what it looks like. Conversely, at times, when we're not treating each other well, God disappears from their sight, and we prohibit them from seeing. People still desire to see something tangible, to see something concrete. And God has designed it so that He can provide that, not in images of wood and stone, but in images that are living flesh, ourselves. Not that we're God, but that people can see God in us and through us. We are people who have received grace, and so we need to extend it to others. And I invite the praise team to come up as we begin to close here. So where is God? Where does He hang out? What does He look like? When I close my eyes, I don't have that old man in the clouds picture anymore. What I think about now is faces around me. So where is God? What does He look at? Look at Sam. There he goes. And I think the challenge for us this morning, the challenging question is not necessarily what we see, but when people come to this place, when people see us as a church, what do they see? Will they see the face of God? Let's worship Him.